Hello, everyone. Welcome here. I'm glad you're all here and we braved the weather to join us here today. I'm Sunday Steinkirchner. I'm the owner of B&B Rare Books. We have a rare book gallery right here in Manhattan. I'm also the vice chair of the ABA's Mid-Atlantic chapter and the chair of the New York International Antiquarian Book Fair. I'd like to welcome you all here to NYIABF Presents. Welcome to Presentations in Provenance. Books signed by the author have always been desirable, but there's a spectrum of importance and value depending on the manner in which the book was signed and who owned it. A book is not only signed but inscribed to someone notable or influential in the author's life can place it in an entirely different league of value. Joshua Mann will be showing us and discussing several examples from B&B's inventory. I know you. Joshua Mann co-founded B&B in 2003 with his partner Sunday. Joshua's specialties include Victorian literature, modern American literature, signed books, presentation copies, science, and baseball. He has lectured on the value of signatures and author associations and is a books and manuscripts appraiser for ABAA book fairs. He'll be doing Discovery Day tomorrow. Although literature is at the heart of B&B, his clinical research background in biology and medicine has led to an additional focus in the history of science and medicine. Joshua is a New York City native, and his favorite book is The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's your turn.
Thank you, Sunday. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you. So, you got me? Okay. Yeah, so this has always been a fun talk, the 3 other or so times I've done this. Mostly because of the questions I get towards the end, but I want to save room for the questions. So I'm going to give sort of an introduction to, our approach to autographs and why we cherish them, why they're important to us, sort of beyond the book. Because you're at a book fair, obviously, but the other piece of it, this other variable we like to introduce is this provenance and signatures and how does that influence the value of a book. So I'm going to kind of start at the beginning, with book printing and, the earliest signatures we sort of, become witness to and sort of where we are now with autographs. So you kind of start with, things that had someone's book plate and then an ownership signature all the way up into modern day book signings and what that has done to the value of books and how it's also influenced the books that came before it. So, how is a book evaluated if it was signed prior to, let's say the 1980s when, authors were doing book signings? And what does it mean when something is just signed or is it inscribed to someone? How does that impact the value? And those are questions we get a lot, but I want everyone to sort of start thinking about what questions they want to ask because I'd like to use the other half of the time to answer questions because we always have excellent questions about autographs. So what I'll start with is early provenance. So with books, people always had an appreciation for a book, but what was it about ownership that might now influence value? So, so if we go back to, let's say, something early, so like a 19th century book. So I have a bunch of examples. So this is a book that is really just valued for provenance. This is a book that was owned by James Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans, Pathfinder, Deerslayer. And it's not a book that was authored by him, but it was a book that he might have impacted the writing of. So this was published a year after one of his books on Italy. And this is a book about Sicily, which, these were contemporary writers who probably knew each other. It's hard to say, but Wyatt, I think you discovered there was possibly a connection between the writers. So we have an ownership signature on the top of the page here. That's just J. Cooper. And this book actually came out of Cooperstown, and by way of the Cooper family. So that's sort of an ideal thing that we're looking for when we're wanting to evaluate a signature, because the question I'll always ask someone when they present us with anything that's signed is, where did you get it, right? What's the provenance? That's always the first place I like to start. when we're evaluating the signature before I even look at the signature, because I don't really even care what the signature looks like until I have an understanding of where it might have come from. And then this has all those things for it. This is a book that otherwise probably wouldn't be that valuable. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of, and I don't even remember the name of the author. Henry Tuckerman. Anyone know who Henry Tuckerman was? Probably not. But you know who James Fenimore Cooper is, right? So it's a Fenimore Cooper signature that gives this book value. I mean, this book's in original boards. It's an early 19th century book. But, so in terms of value, so we had this priced at $1,750? Yeah, $1,750. So it's a book that otherwise probably would have been maybe $100 or $200. So this is something that's purely impacted by the value of the signature and the provenance. So I was going to come to this one later, but I wanted to sort of talk about when people and publishers started appreciating the autograph. When we talk about provenance in that way, we see ownership signatures like that as we kind of move backwards from the 19th century. We see in the 18th century, 17th century, pretty much from the time, of the 15th century when we first saw the printed book. But something happened, I think, in like the late 19th century when we started looking at books in a different way. Publishers started to recognize that books were a little bit more cherished when they had an autograph. So a good example of that is in the late 19th century, we start seeing signed limited editions. So we see those 1 of 250, 1 of 500, 1 of 99, whatever it is, right? And for some reason, those books often turn up in good condition. So why would that happen? Why would those books generally turn up in good condition? When you see an autograph in a book, there was something that I would imagine sort of connects the buyer or the eventual owner to that book. Like we may feel a connection to owning that tangible book because the book's meaningful to us in some variety of ways, but the signature, I think, is what allows us to feel maybe something closer to the writer because their hand was in the book, right? So that, I think, strengthens our connection maybe as collectors to the material. So that would probably help sell a book, right? If I'm a publisher, I want to promote a book, I issue 250 copies signed by Oscar Wilde. So we do that limited edition, and I don't think people are just going to throw that away. So those turn up, remarkably well preserved. So it's strange when you see like a limitation of 50 copies, and we may have seen 15 or 20 examples with those individual numbered copies come through the market over the period of 15 or 20 years. So it seems like a book that was pretty well preserved. So that's the signed limited type thing. So we start seeing more of that. Early 20th century becomes a lot more popular with publishers to start doing signed limited editions. I picked this one because it's one of Sunday's favorites. So this one's signed by Virginia Woolf, and it has an inscription that says "out of series." Wyatt, can you show that over there? Yeah. So it's in Virginia Woolf's like classic purple ink. It's a beautiful signature. That book was supposed to be individually numbered, but publishers, will often issue more than enough. In that case, they did. So that was probably retained by the publisher. So what ended up happening is what made this one a little extra special is because it didn't get individually numbered, but you saw where it said "out of series." That's in Leonard Woolf's hand. And that's kind of what made that book a little more special. Why? What was that priced at? So it's around $5,000, $5,500. So, so in that sense, you're really paying for the Virginia Woolf autograph and then maybe something additional for that, out of series in Leonard's hand. So that makes that even a little more special within a limited edition. So it's not just one of your typical numbered copies, but it just happened to be Leonard's hand in that book as well. So I'm going to move away a little bit from, show that in a sec. Move away from the limited editions and then start talking about how value impacts a trade edition. So the book is not required to be signed. So when we have those limitation leaves that come through the publisher, signed by the author, we know that was something that the author did in collaboration with their publisher to promote their book, right? But so what happens if we see an autograph, kind of like what we saw with that Fenimore Cooper signature? that book wasn't required to be signed by Fenimore Cooper. This book wasn't required to be signed by A.A. Milne, although there are various A.A. Milne limited editions of pretty much most of his books. So here we just have a signature on the title page. It's not inscribed to anyone in particular. If it was inscribed to someone in particular, we'll talk about what that might also do for the value of the book. So we're just right now moving just through the signatures themselves and the trade editions. So that's a book that's typically $2,000, $3,000 unsigned. And here now we have a book that's what, $12,500. So you add about $10,000 of value to that copy just by having A.A. Milne's signature in it because it's in a trade edition. So, so there's something probably more desirable to certain collectors about having a book that wasn't required to be signed. But now let's try to build on that. So if we're trying to build on that, if it wasn't required to be signed, and now let's say it was signed to someone connected to the author, how does that impact the book, right? So, what would be a good one? What do you want to do? The Potters? Okay, so here, you do that one, Wyatt. So, all right, this is too popular to avoid. So you do that one, and I think I have the inscribed one. Okay. All right, so yeah, this is one that's often good to use at the end when we're talking about book signings and things like that, but also we're using it for the example of a flat, what we call like a flat signature versus a presentation. So this is what we call a presentation copy, because we have an inscription to a Barry. We actually know who Barry is because we bought the book from him. But also he worked alongside Arthur Levine during the publication of the book, and he met J.K. Rowling in person at Scholastic and had the book signed for him. So we probably put a little bit more of a premium on something like that, something that's connected to the author, that has that provenance, not necessarily someone who may have impacted, the author's writing or the further publications of the book, but we put a small difference in price between the two. So what did we put that one? So that one's $12,500 versus $15,000 for the book that has the provenance, right? So both signatures, check out, we're 100% confident in them being genuine. But when I originally started, I always asked that question, where did the book come from? So, so sort of in the same thing with like in the art world, provenance is critical. It should be that critical with books as well, especially when we have something inscribed. It's nice sort of being able to piece it together and having some sort of lineage for the book, knowing where it came from and who had previously owned it. And also collectors tend to appreciate that. And I know a few of you here who collect that way and have some exceptional presentation copies of things. And I'm going to show another thing that's kind of unusual. This is probably good with presentation. And then we'll get to associations after. So here's another presentation. So I think most people know who Babe Ruth was. So here we have a presentation from Babe Ruth to Alfred V. Sloan. He was a professor at FIT. This was the last book Babe Ruth published, 1948. So this is the Babe Ruth story. And we have a presentation inscription from Babe Ruth. Hold it out wide, thanks. And there are actually a couple more inscriptions on the other page. Fortunately, it has those tape stains, but those were people associated with the Yankees. One was a general manager, and the other was a former player on the Yankees as well. So it has additional Yankees provenance that sort of ended up inscribed in there as well. So that's more of a provenance thing. It wasn't like a fellow ball player or someone like that he inscribed it to, but we do have something like that where now we can talk a little bit more about associations. So, and then in terms of value, the $10,000, it's a $300 book otherwise. So that kind of added a tremendous amount of value because a Babe Ruth autograph in that kind of condition, at a minimum is adding $8,000 to $10,000, regardless of what it was signed on, what the object was. I don't know how many baseball fans are here, but I like using this because this is a strong association type item. So we bought part of Lefty Gomez's library recently. Now, Lefty Gomez was a fellow player of Babe Ruth in the 30s. The 1937 World Series, Game 1 of the World Series was against the New York Giants. The other pitcher was Carl Hubbell. This is a photo from Carl Hubbell, inscribed by Carl Hubbell to Lefty Gomez. So the two opposing 1937 World Series pitchers. And this is from Lefty Gomez's estate. So, you want to show that around? So that's kind of a fun thing. So that's the kind of thing I find for us as booksellers, we get excited about it in the same way a collector could really appreciate something like that if they feel that connection to baseball and, in the 30s and all that. So, we also have a number of induction letters that Lefty had retained over the years when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. So we have all the correspondence he had with the baseball organizations, with fellow players, other Hall of Famers. So those are the kind of things we like to see when we see them within a book, But to just give this a little context, we see that a lot with letters and correspondence and things like that. So it's hard to find that inside a book, but when we do, it does add a tremendous amount of value to it. So I'm going to use, Barry, your book now, because I think you gave us the strongest associated piece. And you're also going to be kind of putting me on the Discovery Day spot, because I don't have this for sale, it's your book. But what I do know about this book, first off, is this is a reprint edition of The Sun Also Rises. It's probably a book in this jacket, maybe a couple $100, right? Sun Also Rises came out in 26. This is a reprint from the 50s, I believe. Wyatt, if you can show the inscription. And so Barry had just informed me that book is inscribed by Hemingway. It would be Hemingway towards near the end of his life when he was at the Mayo Clinic, inscribed to his psychiatrist. And then the book was then inscribed from that psychiatrist to another doctor that was on the same team, was a fellow psychiatrist as well. But you have the presentation from Hemingway to that psychiatrist. So then the question ends up being, how much value does that add to a book that seemingly doesn't have a lot of value? And I'm not going to ask what you paid for it and when, I'm just going to take a stab at it, okay? So to me, if that book came in on Discovery Day, and I'm looking at a Hemingway with a certain type of association, and we do a lot of Hemingway material, so we kind of can see what that inscription might do for that book. So if it was just an autograph, say, Hemingway inscribed a lot, so I would always be wary of just seeing a Hemingway signature in a book that wasn't a sign limited of a Farewell to Arms. That's the only Hemingway signature I would personally probably trust and want to own, unless it was inscribed, because he did inscribe a lot of books. So in this case, we have a book inscribed to a psychiatrist. It's a strong association, someone who had an impact on the author's life. So at a minimum, that inscription, without the association, you're probably starting at a value of $6,000 to $8,000. If we factor in the psychiatrist, that's where we start being a little bit more creative with it. But, we have to weigh it against what other comparable things have sold for that have strong associations like this. So with an association like that, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 possibly. Would that be okay to you? Yeah, that's good. That's good? Okay. So, yeah. So, and how do we know that? How do we know it was one of the last ones? Through Sotheby's? Okay, so that's helpful. So one of the last books he might have signed, and with a strong association like that. If you put that inscription, now he wouldn't have inscribed it to his psychiatrist in the 20s, because I don't believe he had one in the 20s, but if we had an association like that, in a first edition of The Sun Also Rises, we're sort of approaching now sort of like a possible multi-six-figure book. So if you see it within a first edition. So, but we kind of see what an association does just to move the value of a book that otherwise wouldn't have all that much value, right? And then even circling back to that photograph of Carl Hubble pitching and, inscribed from Lefty Gomez, how much is that, $17.50? Yeah. So that's what that association did for that photograph that may only be worth like $50 or $100, but that's what it adds to it. And then I'm just going to show a couple other things. This is sort of from Lefty Gomez's library as well. So it's double signed. Oh, but it's on the other page. Yeah, well, we'll just show the ones for now. So yeah, we have Lefty Gomez's ownership signature here. This is a book. It's not lacking an end paper. That's the end paper. Okay. So, but this is a book that without that signature, it's a $50 book about Lou Gehrig, right? But it is a Lou Gehrig book owned by his teammate, right? So we put $300 on it. We have a lot of books like this. He signed pretty much all the books that he owned that were within his library, but it's a nice thing. It's a Lefty Gomez signature at what I feel is kind of a modest price, just based on the value of his autograph. But it's kind of neat. So if you're a Yankees fan, or you're gifting something to a Yankees fan, it's a unique item, that has that kind of association, and it's from Lefty's estate in his library. And then I'll just go through a couple more examples here. So I think when I was thinking about which books to show here, because our inventory is always changing, so I have different books to use as props, which is always fun. And I was thinking, and Barry, the book you brought was kind of perfect, because I wanted to show books that otherwise wouldn't be valuable unless they had a signature or an inscription or something like that. And this one's another good example of it. So, people familiar with Player Piano, Vonnegut? Yeah, so still pretty popular today. This is a science fiction book club edition, probably a $100 book. If Vonnegut signed it, at a minimum, his signature adds about $300 to $400 possibly to the book. But if he does a self-caricature of him, so there's sort of a minimum value when we see a self-caricature. I think someone told me the other day they had the self-caricature on their back, and a tattoo of it on their back. So that's pretty dedicated. So what does this do in terms of value? If we saw it in a first edition of Slaughterhouse 5, which we've had a couple times, popular collected book, last time we had one, it was like $6,000 in a book that's otherwise maybe $1,000. So this is a book, like I said, it's like a $100 book. That self-caricature brought it up to $1,500. So, so it's easier to see sort of how this influences the value of a book that otherwise, again, wouldn't have a tremendous amount of value. So it's kind of easier to wrap our heads around. But when I use that example with Barry's book, with being a reprint edition, and if we had an association copy like that, if it was inscribed into a first edition of The Sun Also Rises, that it does crazy things to the price, right? We're at that six-figure price point. So, because The Sun Also Rises is, already at a minimum without an autograph in a dust jacket, $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 book possibly. So you add a Hemingway inscription to that with some major association. But recently, I don't know if you remember the sale last year, the Maxwell Perkins In Our Time, $270,000. So, yeah. So there was a book that was discovered, Hemingway's In Our Time, before he started working with Max Perkins, inscribed by Hemingway to Max Perkins. It was actually just a very kind of just gentle, very professional best wishes inscription. Here's my book. And later on, he took a big chance with him. But that is an incredible association. That's someone who made Hemingway largely the writer he became. And that book sold for $270,000 in a book that was already worth probably about, without that, there were only 170 copies of that. that in our time. But, you know, in our time's now, $40,000, $50,000 possibly, Barry, right? So with that inscription, it's over $250,000. So that's a special thing. And then the last thing I'll use, because I got it just in time for the book fair. I've never seen an inscribed copy of this before. So for the Faulkner fans, so we have an inscribed As I Lay Dying, and it also happens to be the first state of it. So the first state of it is kind of there's a weird typographical error on page 11 where there's an uppercase I that was misaligned on at the beginning of the chapter. And this has the misaligned I, and it also happens to be inscribed by Faulkner in 1936. So the book was published in 30, and then he happened to get a hold of it. This was a known signing that he did in Los Angeles in 36, so a number of books did turn up signed with the same date, similar inscription. So this was a tricky thing to evaluate because we didn't have anything to compare it to. I wasn't aware of any other inscribed copies of As I Lay Dying that looked like this. So how do we evaluate it? The best thing we can do is look at what comparable Faulkner things have done over the last 10 or 20 years. So what happens if a Faulkner book that hasn't surfaced in a while appears? So this is a book that's worth $5,000, $6,000 unsigned. That's already a pretty valuable first edition with a dust jacket. We're putting out it in the fair for $20,000. I think that's probably a soft price. If I asked Don over there, he probably would disagree, right? It should probably be more. Should probably put more on it. 20,000 is not enough, probably. But I think it was fair. For now, that's fair. It's a good starting point for the book fair. But but for a book we've never seen inscribed, and it's an important novel. So that's kind of where we placed it, because I think that's what's been comparable for similar Faulkner items. But it's pretty exciting for us now that we've done this for 20 years, and I've never even seen another signed one. So is that the last one? All right. So I think those are all the book props. I hope you guys have been holding questions, because signatures are, sort of a tricky thing. Yeah. Why books and autographs? Yeah, I started with books, but that's actually a really good question, because that also has to transport me back to what I was personally interested in before I started doing this as a business. Because for me, based on what I kind of put out here, I collected baseball memorabilia as a kid. I collected autographed baseballs, so it's funny you said balls and things like that. And it's something I still maintain an interest in. So I think it was something that I kind of looped back into what we're doing with books, because I started very much as a purist in terms of I just wanted to have the best possible first editions of important books to sell, right, as I was trying to learn this business. But then the longer I did this, I was finding that an autographed book is sort of something that sets the book apart from all the others. So you may say, I just want to have the finest possible example of a particular first edition. But what if you have the finest possible example that's also signed? There's not a lot to pull from source-wise. So that's, as a business, something that's benefited us a lot, but it also makes this interesting. So, any one of these books, I'll be honest, the Harry Potter books are always available. They're always out there. But when something's signed, when something has the provenance, that's something that's, one, fun for us to acquire, own, but then the eventual buyer has that much more appreciation when we're able to retain that provenance and pass that along. So I think that's sort of what's made this a lot more rewarding for us, just sort of personally and professionally, kind of, bridging that between autographs and then, the first editions of the books themselves. Yeah, that's a good question.
I've noticed them sometimes these days when authors sign
That's a great question. And he just reminded me I did still need to talk about book signings and sort of how that's impacted values as well. But the dating is tremendously helpful. Obviously, if we don't have a date, we have to work from when the book was published and just clearly assume if the book was published in 55 or something like that Hemingway was, he could have inscribed it in 56, 57, 58, but we don't have an exact date. When we have a date, though, so let's take a signature that's close to the time the book was published, that's ideal, right? So if we see a presentation that's dated the day the book was published, or even better, a few days before the publication of the book, we'd have to use some examples to show you kind of what that does to the value, but we'll use the Hemingway example. If that, first edition of Sun Also Rises was inscribed in 1926, when he was in Paris, had a date, we knew what was going on in the author's life at that time, close to the publication of the book, it's going to be more valuable. If that signature was added to the book in the 50s, depending on who it was inscribed for, that would influence it, but it wouldn't be as impactful as it was if it's like contemporary to the book's publication. Yeah. Does that sort of answer that question? Okay.
How do you actually authenticate the signatures?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The authentication process, how do we do that? So we were talking about that a little before we had started, how we go about authentication, and I was using those two J.K. Rowling books next to each other. One we know is proven. Proven meaning we have full provenance. We know exactly where it came from, right? So if we're assembling, let's say, a database, and we're pulling letters and documents that were signed by J.K. Rowling at various time periods, because that book was signed in 98. At least that's what we were told. So let's see. So we have to see if everything adds up. So what did her signature look like in 98? It doesn't matter what her signature looks like today. It also is going to matter exactly when it was signed. Because like Hemingway, again, his signature, we know what his signature looked like in the 50s. His signature looked different in the 20s. All our signatures change over time. Some get bigger, some get smaller, some become more angled. Even the placement on a page. So those are all things we consider when we're evaluating it. But if we have something like just what we said, like sort of that flat signed book, we just have a signature to work with, we have to compare it against all the other proven examples. And we only offer it if we're absolutely 100% about it being genuine. If we have any shred of a doubt, we don't take it on. That's it. Someone else may have a different opinion because at the end of the day, signature authentication is a professional opinion. That's what they say in all the authentication documents. It's in our professional opinion that we believe this to be genuine. So that's what we can go on. But that's why I also like to add the provenance part to it, because that gives us a tremendous amount of reliability in the authentication of the autograph. Yeah. Yeah. So in bookselling, I'm largely self-trained, but I think what's helped me a lot is my background in the sciences. So somebody mentioned I did clinical research. I was a science student. I should have stayed in medical school, maybe not, I don't know. But then again, I had a method to evaluating signatures. And there are certain authors we can do that very well with. There are other ones that challenge us a lot more. So, but when I was talking to you guys before, we were just talking about something about the flow of ink. Like how do we even establish looking at a book in that way? Like the flow of ink, the size of the letters, the placement of the autograph. There are a lot of things that can go wrong in a forgery, right? So I didn't want to have to use the word forgery here because I never wanted to discourage anyone from owning an autographed book. But there's a lot of work that goes into evaluating that book to give us confidence. So when we're looking at size, angle, flow, the speed of the autograph, we can tell basically how fast someone's hand moves by the way the ink flows from the pen and what type of pen they used. So those are all factors. Did someone typically use a steel-tip fountain pen when they did their autographs? Did they use a ballpoint? Were they using markers at their signings? If someone told us they got the book from a signing, then we may want to try to line that up to see what kind of pen that author was typically using at a book signing. So there's a lot of research that goes into it. But then there's also just sort of our gut reaction to a signature. That's always our starting point. So if I ever have that reaction where I'm not sure, it's not usually going to get much better. So if I don't start off confident, then yeah, it's probably not going to check out. And that's not to say it's not genuine. It's just saying I'm not sure. So I would either pass that along to someone else who might have another opinion of it that could explain it better than maybe I can. But there's a process depending also on who the autograph is from too. But sort of fundamentally, we sort of approach it the same way. Comparing size, flow, all those various factors. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so that reminded me again, I still needed to talk about the book signings. So last week when I was preparing the talk here, we were talking about book signings, and then it occurred to me about how sort of book signings created a lot of problems for inscriptions, right? Because it changed everything. Because up to that point, when something was inscribed, it would really just be about my talk about provenance, right? That was the only thing that mattered, was who it was inscribed to and who previously owned it. And it's just the same as like having someone's book plate in the book. It's nice knowing where it came from and who might have owned it and how that influenced the value. But a book signing, it like flipped it on its head, right? So if I turn up at a book signing and I want the book inscribed, no offense to Wyatt, but inscribed for Wyatt or me, it's not going to help me be able to resell it. So that's going to be difficult because it's just out of a book signing, right? And then it's sort of like this memorabilia approach to collecting where all that mattered was the autograph and you didn't want any noise around it, right? And that's also something we see in sports memorabilia as well. Things aren't worth the sum of their parts. Using the Babe Ruth example, a Babe Ruth single autographed item is typically worth more than something that might have been signed by the 1927 Yankees. So it's a strange thing, but it's something about that isolated autograph that is more important to the collector rather than having it crowded with some inscription to someone that may not have been connected to that person. So I find book signings have sort of created those problems in a way, but as we go backwards, it's helped us with what we consider sort of more vintage. So if the material preceded the book signings, I think it makes that material even more attractive to us. So it's helped and sort of hurt things in a way. But authors also tend to be aware of that too. So some authors, if you bring a book to a signing, I think Stephen King does this, you're not going to get a copy of Carrie signed when he has his new book come out. So he actually allows himself to keep the supply of his autographs in his earlier books limited and more valuable for that reason. So, and that's a common thing with authors. They'll only sign the book that was recently published. So that's something that can be impactful as well. Peter? Yep. It does, but I'm thinking for modern autographs, like the J.K. Rowling, I think, was the exception, right? And I would still prefer to have a J.K. Rowling inscription that has some provenance. It doesn't need to be an association that adds more value to it, but it does help us with the authentication of it. Because, to be honest, there are a lot of bad J.K. Rowling signatures out there. So when there are concerns about authenticity, to me, and in book selling, that matters a lot more. It's something that's much more problematic in other industries. Like in memorabilia, and I'll use the sports memorabilia example, they don't really try to account for provenance the same way, not even close to what we do in books. So when I'm looking at something that could be considered, borderline sports memorabilia like that photograph, the provenance matters to me. I'd much rather have that any day than, just the signature on it, so with or without the association. But I don't think everyone collects that way. Yeah.
Another thing, aren't there certain ones, like I heard Capote is one of the hardest ones to authenticate.
Yeah, Faulkner for the same reasons, because it's a print signature, and it looks sloppy, it looks like someone made the signature with sort of like a shaky hand, and it is actually a very tricky one to authenticate. We've had some really interesting Capote material over the years that has had such great provenance. It's allowed me to ignore the other ones that lack it because we've had those concerns about Capote material. So I'll give you a Capote example. So this probably is 10 years ago, this came up at an auction. I didn't even look at the lot. All I read is like a tiny little auction description of the item that was an atlas that was inscribed by Capote. Had a big full-page inscription on it. The atlas was owned by Perry Smith. Does everyone know who Perry Smith was? So for those who might have read in Cold Blood or seen the film, Perry Smith was one of the two murderers that was on death row. And Truman was visiting him regularly when he was doing his research for In Cold Blood. And we had all these personal effects that were Perry Smith's. So there was all these, it gives me the chills thinking about it because it's kind of eerie. But we had pamphlets, art pamphlets, that had his inmate number on it in Perry's hand and in the warden's hand as well. And then the book also had Perry's inmate number written in it and the full-page inscription from Truman to Perry. So I couldn't think of a better In Cold Blood association type thing I would want to own, because that book probably otherwise wouldn't be valuable at all. It's like a $50 atlas, probably less than that. At the time, we priced it at $6,000 because it was all association in that type of item. And we even kept some of the art pamphlets just because we'll never see something like that again, just so, it was interesting. But Capote is very tricky. Yeah. That book, I'd probably put $25,000 on it, maybe more. In that room, with that type of association, absolutely, yeah. And I probably made a mistake because it was bought by a dealer. so they had a little more vision than maybe I did at the time. Yeah.
Tell them or the Louisa Taylor.
I think that's better. You discovered it, Don. I didn't. So we, yeah.
It's what's the association
Yep.
who signed the book is not the author.
Yeah.
It's a unique example.
Yeah. So that the Northanger Abbey. So I'll give Don a little more credit for this because I wasn't aware of it at the time we bought it, but we were purchasing a first edition of Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. And we bought it not even aware of the provenance. That came later when we were actually cataloging it and writing up the book. So Don, the Louisa Taylor was interesting because Louisa Taylor had signed the book, had owned that copy of Northanger Abbey, so we have to figure out who's Louisa Taylor, because that's not something that rolls off the top of her head. So she had a competitive love interest with Jane Austen. So they knew each other well, and the Jane Austen, so Louisa married,
Louisa
you right?
Taylor was married to Captain Taylor.
Yeah.
Who Jane Austen in her letters had spoken of him as if she was interested in him. He was a good-looking man. She spoke very fondly of Captain Taylor in her letters. And Louisa Taylor married Captain Taylor. So the point, I guess, is that was like we said, it was like a $5,000 book.
Well, at the time,
That
yeah.
changed the value. Even though Jane Austen did sign it, it tripled or quadrupled the value of the book.
Oh, absolutely.
Jane Austen, they probably knew, Louisa Taylor knew Jane Austen, and they shared the same.
Yeah. So that's value purely influenced by provenance. So, at the time, we were only looking at that, at the time, Northanger Abbey was a $10,000 book. This is what, 5 years ago? Now Northanger Abbey, that, without that association, that's a $20,000 book now. That's 100% appreciation on that book alone. Now you add that Provenance in there with the Louisa Taylor. At the time, do you remember what we had it priced at?
Like 24.
It was like between 20 and 25,000? Yeah, it would be a lot more than that now. So it would be like 40 or 50 now. So, yeah, but, yeah.
So you talked about Provenance being like a corroborating factor in the authenticity, and that's fascinating that often helps authenticate the book. And kind of almost gotten there, but how about when the association copy expands on the knowledge that wasn't known?
Something unknown?
Yeah. So you learn something historic about one of these authors that that hasn't been written in the history books. What was that piece of value?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example of something we may have discovered where we witnessed that, because most of that information, I feel like it's all out there, right? It's out there, right? So
Yeah. Are there examples where it's not been out there and you find
I think we see that maybe not as much within a book as we might do within letters. So letters kind of give us sometimes a little more information, or maybe unpublished manuscripts, or something like that. So if we keep it within the context of a book, maybe we should have. Excuse me. I give it 5 seconds, otherwise I'm just going to carry on anyway. But yeah, I mean it's New York. So, trying to think of an example. Well, I would say in a presentation copy, I'm not sure we maybe have seen that in terms of association. We only discover what that association might have been by, looking up who it was inscribed for. But let's say the inscription might have been a holograph poem, an unpublished poem or something like that. That might do it, right? So we have seen that before. Or maybe someone scrolled some prose into part of that inscription, or referenced something from another book that had not been published yet. Like, we've seen things like that. So I think that's more in the manuscript than it is maybe in some type of historical association. But that would probably be, in my experience, the best way to answer that. Yeah.
a whole other question?
Go for it.
So when I brought that book into
Yep.
the Harry Potter book, you didn't know me. I think it would just be really interesting for you to tell everybody why you know this real.
Why I believe it was be real? Yeah. So we were touching on that a little bit before about about your question about size and the ink flow and things like that, and we were discussing that a little bit before we had started. But when you first showed it to me, what did we ask you? Where did it come from? And you told me where it came from. Didn't really help authenticate it at all, right? I mean, you basically just bought it and just found out it was signed, like that it was, So, yeah. So what did we have to do? We started with one. Like I said, we have our sort of gut reaction to an autograph. So you made it actually very difficult in a way because we didn't have the provenance. So we had to strictly authenticate a signature at that point. So we're just looking at a signature without an inscription. So the first place we start is, the size of the autograph, the flow of the ink, the type of pen that was used. But those are things that, after a while of looking at certain signatures, become a little more instinctual to us. Because when we see a bad one, we know pretty much right away whether it was bad. And there's within the J.K. Rowling signatures, there are certain things that are generally consistent across all her autographs. But when we see something that might feel a little bit off, we just put it aside. She signed a lot of books. So it's not worth us taking a chance on something that, we have any shred of a doubt about. But part of the process was we initially saw it, you brought it into a book fair. Looked good to us at that point. Then when we brought it back, we did the rest of our homework, comparing it against all the other proven signatures we've had and we've seen. whether it's a letter or another book. But yeah, but comparing, again, the size of the autograph, the flow of the pen, and then, you know, the ink that she used and all those things, and the placement of the signature too. So that's how we eventually got there. Yeah. Yeah. Question?
So in relationship to contemporary sign practices, I'm curious what you think the future is for things like signed book plates being pasted in
Oh yeah.
contemporary books, publishers are putting in signed sheets. I'm just curious what you share.
From publishers or just from publishers? Okay. Because if it's not from a publisher, I probably wouldn't even bother with it. You know, I was going to use the Vonnegut as an example. So the Vonnegut's we brought, there was one book from that collection we brought to the fair that had just a laid-in bookplate signature from Vonnegut. Just came with the collection, but I think because it's the New York Book Fair, we wanted to bring the best material we had available. We left that one in the shop, and for a reason, because it's that type of thing to me is only worth the sum of the parts. You can't call it a signed book. Like anyone who tries to, and I know this is being recorded, but I'm confident in saying I would never call a book that has an affixed or laid-in bookplate a signed book. And there's only one exception. If there's some provenance that went with that. If we knew who owned that book and who owned that bookplate, right? And then that bookplate was inserted because we know it was that person's. So that person in some context that, you know, met the author, had that bookplate signed, and then laid it into their personally owned book, that to me would be the exception. I can't think of another exception. But you also asked about the publisher leaf being inserted. That goes back to Capote, with your question about In Cold Blood. So there is a signed edition of In Cold Blood that has an inserted publisher leaf with Capote's signature on it. I mean, he also did a signed limited of In Cold Blood, so I would be more comfortable just owning the signed limited edition that called for it being signed. When I know you had a question about inserted leaves, but this is pretty much getting us there, right? So that to me, an inserted leaf, if we know it's from the publisher, yeah, that's helpful, but I would want to own a book that author physically held, right? And that's also a factor with signed limited editions too that people don't realize. So that copy of On Being Ill that we started with, that's signed by Virginia Woolf, she didn't hold that book. She signed the sheet. You know, especially if the publisher is, let's say, in New York, and then she's in like London or Richmond or wherever she was at the time, they're shipping a stack of sheets for her to sign and send back to the publisher that gets bound into the book. So when you're owning a signed limited of a book, that's important to bear in mind. And again, there's all the more reason for that presentation copy or a book that did not call for the autograph to be more valuable, right? Because then you know the author held that book, right? So that Sun Also Rises, that was in Hemingway's hands. It wasn't some leaf that someone laid in there and then called it a signed book, or, you know, and I'm just going to go right to that question you had, right? So before we started to talk, he had a question about, you know, well, what about, you know, binding in a leaf into a book that was from another copy of a book that might have been the same title, the same publication, the same size page. What I always tell people is I'll almost never offer a book that has repaired hinges and a presentation inscription inside it, because, and I'm glad I'm telling you this as you're walking into the New York Book Fair. If anyone sees one, I want to know about it, but we'll kind of be quiet about it, I guess, but if we can. But I would exercise a lot more caution if I saw something like that, because that can be done. And then you can just say, oh, the book has repaired hinges, and then the leaf looks otherwise fine, like it looks like it was integral and part of the book. But we've caught things that way that, you know, might have seemed fine, might have had that repaired hinge, something like that. What about something we call offsetting, which is, let's see if we have anything that's offsetting, Wyatt, so I can show them what I mean. See if that has any. Barry, your book's too clean. So anything with offsetting? So I'll just explain kind of what offsetting is. So offsetting is sort of like some acidification of the paper where it's toned, right? The page is toned. There's maybe some yellowing or something like that. When a dust jacket wraps around the front paste down of a book, you can kind of see when you peel back the dust jacket, underneath the dust jacket, it may appear more white than the boards themselves. That might appear a little bit more yellow on that page. So we've discovered things that might have had an inserted leaf because the offsetting didn't line up with the page next to it, right? So, or sometimes something could be toned, and then that whatever got in there, maybe it was some moisture, and it flows through 10 pages, like let's say it's flowing through 10 pages, and it skips the one that was autographed. I wouldn't bother with that book. So, 5 minutes. I probably have time for like 1 or 2 other questions. Don, did you have another one?
No, so
Yeah.
what do you think? I know I've seen where people send book plate to Tolkien, and Tolkien signed the book plate for the person,
Yeah.
and they send it back.
Yeah.
You wouldn't feel so bad about that, right?
Right. I think that would kind of, okay, there is one of those exceptions too. But that book plate, I would still be looking at it like it's just the value of the book plate inserted in the book, right? Yeah. So it's, again, to me, it's, again, the sum of the parts, right? It's not an exponential thing where I got my Tolkien book plate, I put it in my first edition of The Hobbit, and, you know, now I want $250,000 for it, right? So, right? So, yeah.
Just one more thing, we were talking about
Yeah.
presentation copies. Mary yesterday came across one of the Jeffrey Marks has a presentation copy. Which Henry book was it? Death in the Afternoon.
Ring Lardner?
Ring
Yeah,
Lardner.
I saw that.
In which he calls himself your imitator and admirer, and for Hemingway to be somewhat humble and imitator.
Yeah.
And, you know, in an inscription, though, it's really amazing.
Yeah, with the Ring Lardner Association, and they were both published by, they're both Scribners, and they were both published under Scribners at the same time. So,
That to me is like a perfect inscription.
yeah, that's a perfect example. Did you buy it, Barry? No. Yeah. We're all gonna put, what was it, $135,000 between all of us, maybe, right? So, yeah, yeah. We actually, so, yeah.
How unique is it, the flashman that you got, where the author signed it to the characters, because he was the character in the book, right? That one?
Oh yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, but I think in terms of owning that next to something that was just signed by Flashman, right? But he's sort of, I like the source character type thing too. Like that you just triggered that for me about, so we had do you remember when we had that Dracula that was inscribed to Bram Stoker's niece? That was the source character for Lucy, who was the first vampire in Dracula. So we had her copy of Dracula inscribed by Bram Stoker, right? So when you see something like that sort of circles back to the book itself and ties back in, so if he's inscribing it like one of the characters, if it's owned by someone who influenced the character in the book, like it's a wild thing to evaluate, because A Death in the Afternoon is that copy, it's like a $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 book, but that association in itself is all the value in owning that, right? With that Ring Lardner Association, right? Or again, someone like that source character. That Dracula was a $100,000 book. So of a book that at the time probably otherwise would have been $15,000, $20,000. So yeah, it does make it a little bit more desirable. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.